I'm Dana Perino, and this is Perino on Politics. DEI is DOA, and the first 100 days of President Trump's second term are very much underway. Joining me today is Senior Vice President of CRC Advisors. It's Matt Whitlock. He is a crowd favorite. Welcome to Perino on Politics, where I call up my smart friends and I say, what is going on? Tell me about everything. Let's do big picture first, Matt. I decided this weekend to give up trying to keep up with everything that's happening in the first week of the Trump administration. It is incredible how much stuff is happening all at once. Super organized, seems very professional. Like, you think about all those executive orders to get done in the way that they were, well written, well thought out. That doesn't mean there's not going to be challenges, but wow, there's a lot going on. How do you keep up?
It's amazing. I have to give them a lot of credit. This feels so different than 2017. I was in the Senate then, and I think the feelings, the vibes are just night and day different, in part because in 2017, I don't think we were nearly as unified. Part of it was, we had all the dials saying that there was like a 95% chance of Hillary winning, and then Trump came in and took it. And so it took time for people to get on the same page. They obviously passed the Trump tax cuts, but it wasn't close to this level of really kind of swagger that they're feeling. And they came in prepared. And when you look at, one, the volume of executive orders, about 200 of them. Now, I think it's also important to note, I think 87 of those were undoing Biden executive orders on pretty crazy things like ending the White House Gender Policy Council, ending the Biden Commission to put pressure on the Supreme Court, things like revitalizing our commitment to environmental justice for all, things like that. But then there was also a lot of really important structural attack. You mentioned DEI in the intro here. The executive orders focused on DEI are really important because, as we know, DEI is really deeply entrenched in government. If you saw the coverage and feedback from when President Trump put out the order to fire or, release all the DEI officials throughout government, it was like you could feel footsteps of 10,000 people moving towards the doors. That kind of shows you how big and expansive that was within the government. But when I talk about this first week, to your point, there's so much going on that I look at really three key inflection points. One, the night of many executive orders. I think, again, conservatives don't always love a lot of executive orders, but President Biden came in with about 100 in his first 100 days, I think 94 of which had to do with the border. And so much of what President Trump is trying to do is, before our government convenes, set a level playing field by undoing some of the worst of what President Biden put in place, which were things like hamstringing our ability to build the wall, hamstringing our border patrol from being able to identify and remove people, and then things like DEI, which I think in a lot of ways conservatives see as kind of a Trojan horse that's been implanted that's going to take a long time to root out. What Trump did with executive orders is really set the table for a lot of that to happen. I think, the executive order night, it was really fun to watch. Those of you who know Will Scharf, he's the staff secretary, doesn't get a ton of attention, but he was the one who was handing the president the executive orders and explaining what they are. He became kind of a mini celebrity by the end of the week because there were multiple signing events. I saw people on Twitter calling him the executive order guy. He's a brilliant, brilliant lawyer who, has worked in different, government departments, worked in the Missouri Attorney General's office, just a really, really smart guy. And so when you look at people like Will and hundreds of others behind him, who have been developing these ideas, these executive orders, but also the way that they flow into the cabinet departments, the way that they're going to work with Congress, you see how that preparation came to be. And this flurry of activity, it didn't come about by accident. President Trump brought in a lot of smart people. They started planning this well in advance, and we're seeing this executed. The second big inflection point that I would mention would be the immigration raids. This is something you and I have talked about quite a bit because they want to put a visual to what they're doing here. These deportation actions are overwhelmingly supported by the public. New York Times, not a conservative pollster at all, found that close to 60% of people support deporting all illegal immigrants. But when you ask about people with a criminal record, 87% in the New York Times poll support deportations of any illegal immigrant with a criminal record. So what ICE is doing is saying, Bill Melugin, ride with us so we can put a face to what we're doing here. And when you see some of those really terrible people that they were arresting, you understand how important it is that they do this. But you also feel a lot of visceral frustration that President Biden let this go on for so long, that local leaders in some of these cities and states are saying, we need to fight to keep these people around because, they have a right to be here. They don't have a right to be here. And one of the
or that they would let them out of the jails in order to not work with ICE. And so they're just in and amongst the population?
Well, and that to me is what's so crazy is, Bill Melugin's talking to some of these people who have been deported multiple times and brought back or released from prison multiple times. It's just horrific. And the White House put out a great thread last night of the worst of the worst that they'd identified. There were pedophiles, murderers, people connected to ISIS. And it's just these people were just in our neighborhoods because President Biden didn't want to take any action to get them out of there. I think that was crazy. And the last inflection point I would mention would be President Trump's California visit. I think that roundtable, I guess it was like a rectangular table discussion, I think really highlighted why President Trump won with a sort of unique coalition that he won with, because you had him sitting at one end and Karen Bass sitting at the other end. And President Trump is basically just saying, these people can't clean up their own homes. They can't even go on their properties.
Just for people who don't know, Karen Bass is the mayor of Los Angeles, and she was in Africa for the inauguration of the Ghanaian president at the time, even though there were emergency warnings about the fires.
Yes. And so President Trump said very clearly, why can't these people get started rebuilding their homes? And Karen Bass said, oh, they can. And President Trump said, no, your people are telling them it's going to take 18 months. And there were a lot of even liberals on social media saying I'm with President Trump on this. Why can't we do it? And that's, I think, one thing that a lot of people find refreshing about President Trump is he doesn't understand a lot of this red tape. He says, do it, and we do it. It was very similar to what happened just yesterday with Colombia and these migrant flights that turned into a bigger conversation about, exports and tariffs. President Trump said, okay, take back your, criminal deportees or we're going to slap tariffs on you. And within about an hour, the president of Colombia is like, hold on, I will use my own plane to complete this if it can stop this, from happening. And so I think that it's cutting through nonsense is a big part of what.
Could we stick on that for one moment? Because you had a post on X that I loved in which you were talking to one of the prominent Democrats, I'll let you describe it, and that they still don't seem to understand why they lost in November and that the priorities of the country, at least the majority of the country, are not what they think they are.
I think it was so interesting to see almost like a bat signal went out to the left saying, this Colombia issue, we've got to highlight, one, the cost of flowers for Valentine's Day is going to be terrible. And two, the cost of your coffee is going up. One, the fact that every paid Biden social media influencer within a half an hour jumped on that message. And you had people like Anna Navarro from The View who were saying, oh, enjoy paying more for coffee. We know how strongly people feel about getting dangerous, violent criminals out of their streets. The idea that, people would be concerned about the price of flowers at Valentine's more than they would be concerned about the safety of their children in their neighborhoods, to me, just again, as a reminder, these people aren't really talking to any normal people. 87% of people support deporting anyone with any kind of criminal record at all. The idea that people will be like, oh, no, not the coffee prices. I just think that's so silly. Lowering prices is a huge, huge, huge priority to people. I would not downplay that. But if you were to poll and do a sort of, A/B test there, you're not going to find people who say, I'm really concerned about the cost of flowers so much that I want to stop the deportations and keep people like these multiple murderers, child rapist types who they have rounded up and are trying to deport here in our country.
Yeah. It was incredible. I did want, before we take a break, I thought I would ask you about how DEI is not just a government issue, but has seeped into, of course, corporate America, but also tell me about the medical community and the educators, because I know you work with a couple of those groups, just so that people understand how pervasive this was and how now maybe there's a way to claw it back.
Absolutely. I think this is such an important discussion because, as I mentioned, it acts like a Trojan horse in that it's been implanted in corporate America, in government, in local government. A group called Parents Defending Education did a giant study on this and found $1 billion in grants were given to schools. Another group called Do No Harm has done phenomenal work tracking not just DEI in government, but also DEI in the medical field, as you mentioned. The number of hospitals out there that are prioritizing things like racial quotas over things like performance. I would just point people to those resources. Parents Defending Education's studies on DEI funding for education. We have about 66% of the kids in our country can't read at their grade level.
Yeah.
And yet the Biden administration was spending more than $1 billion to promote really, really divisive DEI policies that a lot of studies have shown us teach people to have more animosity towards each other than less. But then also in the medical community, this is one that I've seen a lot of really compelling polling where people are concerned that a hospital would prioritize someone's racial, gender, or sexual identity over their qualifications to be able to serve a patient. And
Yeah,
to
let
be
me
able
give
to
an
keep them
example.
alive.
This is what I recall from one instance with Do No Harm that was brought to my attention. But if I get it wrong, you could maybe explain. So it was Johns Hopkins University had a job notice up. There was a job opening. And it was for a senior researcher type of person, a doctor. But it said in the advertise, I want to call it a classified ad, which I don't even know if that's what you call them anymore. But in the job posting, it said, if you're white, you need not apply. Yeah. And so there were somebody at Johns Hopkins saw this, alerted Do No Harm in an anonymous way, and then Do No Harm took a look at it. And as I understand it, they will call and say, do you want to take this down before we go public with this? Or they might even help you bring a lawsuit against it to try to help deal with it. So with an instance like that, given Trump's push on the government side of things and how corporate America is coming around, do you think the medical community and the education world will take notice as well and take their own measures without having to do anything more, at least in the courts?
I think more than anything, this is raising awareness of this issue in places and helping people understand these practices aren't okay. I think with the medical community, with Johns Hopkins, Do No Harm filed a federal complaint about that to HHS because in some form or another, so many hospitals are getting federal dollars for something, and you can't have federal dollars going to promote division, races, and things like that. And so Do No Harm has tons of resources out there to see this, but the other thing that they do so well is act as a vector for these complaints. Parents Defending Education does it in education. Groups like Consumers Research does it so effectively for corporate America, because even for corporate America, a lot of these practices that institutionalize racism will have legal complaints lodged against them. And you've seen so many companies like Target just last week came out and said, we're ending so many of these divisive DEI programs, in part because they know that if they don't do that, they're going to take backlash from their customers. And so I think that what we've seen from corporate America, a lot of it is a pressure system, but I think we're seeing it across the board where leaders are seeing the need to uproot this divisive tool. It's going to take a long time to do, and it's going to take a lot of involvement. A lot of state attorneys general are engaged on this, but it will be a process because it's now a part of the infrastructure of government that needs to be removed, because if it's not, the minute that the pendulum swings back and Democrats are in power again, they're going to be able to reactivate all of these really, really toxic tools to help them carry out their political agendas.
As a last question here, could you speak to somebody who understands this pretty well, I think, across the board, which is you had some Catholic leaders, Christian leaders, lamenting the immigration raids, saying, isn't this against what we're for, which is the compassion and taking people in and helping them. I feel like it's pretty clear that there's a distinction between criminals who are living amongst us illegally. How do you see it?
I think that's so important. The worst first approach that the Trump administration is taking is really important here. They're focusing on the worst of the worst, and they're showing us exactly how bad these people are. And I think, J.D. Vance was asked about this. A lot of the Sunday show discussion yesterday was about deportations, with hosts saying, how can we do this? How can we actually accomplish this? And people like J.D. Vance and Tom Homan saying, this is what people voted for. And it's I think what JD has done well is reframe that to what about compassion for people like Lake and Riley?
Yep.
Compassion for people that just want to be able to walk outside at night. There are studies that show that we have an all-time high of people who are afraid to walk around outside in their own neighborhoods. Things like this are a huge part of that. And so I would just flip that. The compassion needs to extend to people as well who want to be safe in their own neighborhoods. And again, this is not about, the Democrats will try and frame this as separating grandparents and, keeping children away from their parents. That's not the case here. We have 16,000 convicted sexual assailant illegal immigrants, more than 13,000 illegal immigrants who have been convicted of murder, over 1.5 million illegal immigrants who have deportation orders here. That is how you get to where 87% of the country supports this. And so you will see a divide between media and Democrats and where the general populace is. But again, I have to just go back to touch grass. I wish that CBS, before they did this interview with JD Vance, had sent somebody out with ICE to go around Boston and see who they were rounding up and see just how dangerous these people are.
Well, from a communication standpoint, I got to say the embedding of reporters from Bill Malugin of Fox News to Dr. Phil to others. I'm sure if CBS raised their hand and said, I'd love to come, that they would take them along too to show them.
In a second, because the value of it, you talked about this on the 5, and I thought you made such an important point. The image that defined the first Trump administration on immigration was this 4-year-old Honduran girl crying. We all remember it was the cover of Time magazine, and it wasn't for months until we found out that that image was totally inaccurate. It was a girl whose mom was standing a few feet away. She had not been a part of a child separation policy. So the Trump team is going into this knowing we need to show our work here. We need to create visuals to help people understand exactly what we're doing so that it cannot be misrepresented. Remember Whipgate, Whipgate, where activists took an image of a Border Patrol agent using his reins on his horse and made it look like he was whipping migrants, that got 3 days of outraged news coverage before they clarified what it actually was. There won't be another Whipgate.
But even to this day, Biden never apologized to them.
Never apologized.
I so want to interview those guys, so I'm putting it out there. Let us manifest that here. All right, Matt, we will be right back with more Perino on Politics. And we're back with Perino on Politics. We've talked a lot about the Trump administration's first week and those big issues. Can we talk about what sort of little time bombs President Biden left behind?
I think this is super, super important. President Biden was kind of governing with the shot clock in mind, knowing that if he pushed off a lot of the toughest things, people might not hold it against him and they went into the voting booth. One of the biggest examples of that, for example, is one that you've talked about, which is this Medicare crisis. They took money from Medicare to fund parts of the Inflation Reduction Act, including tax credits for electric cars. When they took out that money, what do you think happened? Premiums started going up for seniors on Medicare Part D. And when they saw those start to go up, they said, oh, shoot, we've got a problem here. So they took more money from Medicare to try and patch and say, let's hold off the worst of that hike until after the election. So they basically slated it so that terrible, calamitous hike would come in January, thinking, they would get through the election, win, and find some other way to patch it through. They lost. What's still going to happen this month is seniors are seeing the biggest spike in their prescription fees and their premiums in the history of the program. These are the kind of bombs, the time bombs that President Biden kind of left in place here. This is why you're seeing a lot of different conservatives and conservative groups come out and say, we've got to pause that Inflation Reduction Act and start clawing some of that money back, because they basically set up economic time bombs all over the place when they took money from other programs to fund, electric vehicle tax credits. Honestly, when we talk about why President Biden lost, I think the most elementary reason is they came into office with people wanting normalcy and lowering costs. They didn't do anything to address either of those. They focused on directing money to electric cars and directing money to their donors at solar companies, which you've talked about. It's crazy to see. But I do think one of the other big obstacles that Democrats are trying to sort of plant right now, even as they're kind of lost in the wilderness, is how do we stop this energy renaissance that President Trump is so focused on? He had a lot of executive orders focused on restoring American energy because of how much that helps lower costs of everything. And one of the biggest challenges we're going to have. Wall Street Journal had a really great editorial this morning on the state climate superfund laws, where blue states have basically given themselves the power to sue energy companies for giant billions and billions of dollars worth of penalties, so they can put it in a climate super fund that they will. And when you say climate super fund, like, it's just a giant slush fund for them to do whatever they want with. They'll find ways to divert that money back to these same left-wing political groups that will knock doors for Democrats down the road. But what Wall Street Journal called it is a tax on all of America, because that cost is going to, or that super fund law and all of the different state-by-state litigation trying to kill the fossil fuels industry is just intended to kill energy. That's all they're trying to do here. And so I think, the biggest hindrance to President Trump being able to sort of fix American energy, and Democrats will say we had record number of, oil extraction during the end of President Biden's term, but, they still were doing everything they could to slow it down at the same time so they could talk out of both sides of their mouth. The biggest hindrance is going to be things like those state climate superfund laws and all of this litigation that's tied to dark money groups.
Is that the same type of thing where you have those high school students suing the government of Montana, the state of Montana, and they won, saying that these students are what is their claim, that the state of Montana is ruining their lives because of oil and gas?
It's crazy. And when you get an activist court like the Montana Supreme Court, which just shifted a little bit more to our direction, but is, still a little bit more progressive than you would expect for the Montana Supreme Court. But there's dozens of these all over the place of, different groups. For example, Honolulu has one of the most high profile ones. They have sued all these oil and gas companies for rising sea levels and, the climate emergency. And there's not a lot of science behind this. Basically, like, they're trying to say, we had extreme weather and you did it. And it's a little bit crazy, but they're finding little narrow bits of success in courts like the Hawaii Supreme Court, in courts like the Montana Supreme Court. And so this is a scary thing to watch. And so hopefully it isn't successful, because if, teenagers in Montana with no science behind them can say, you are killing, you're making it rain here, and courts are like, oh, I agree with the children, then all of our energy costs are going to go up. It's going to be crazy.
Let me get a last word from you at the end of this block on the fact that President Trump will meet with House Republicans today. There's a very narrow majority on the House side. They have a lot in front of them, including a big spending bill that they have an unrealistic deadline on. And they want to try to get a tax bill done right away so that Trump's tax cuts from the first term don't expire. I know that you're more of a Senate rat than a House rat, but give us just like a couple sentences on that.
Yeah, I think it's very important to recognize those differences. A 53-seat Senate majority gives the Senate a little bit more wiggle room, but in some cases a little bit more what they feel like is negotiating power than the House, where with the House, President Trump is going to need to be very intimately involved in those details, just as he was in the speaker's race, because you've got a lot of different groups there that have equities that they care about, things like that. I think that they're kind of going back and forth between the one reconciliation bill and the two bill dance. The Senate has focused more on the two bill. The House and the Freedom Caucus came out with a letter over the weekend saying, here's our vision for one bill that accomplishes everything you need to do. Bottom line is President Trump is going to have to roll up his sleeves and be involved there, because you've got a lot of groups in the House that don't really like each other very much and don't really work very well together. But I do think that they work with different parts of the Trump administration well. And so we'll see sort of how that works. But that margin is going to be really scary we had much wider margins in 2017 and still had all the trouble we had with the healthcare bill and getting the tax bill across the finish line. So I think restoring the Trump tax cuts is going to be huge priority number one. It's just everything else that comes with it and how they can get it across the finish line that President Trump will have to be involved in.
We'll have much more Perino on Politics coming up. And we're back with Perino on Politics. Matt, one of the things that I ask in this segment is, what am I missing? What are you paying attention to? I would just like to say that my assistant, Kate, who we all love, everybody loves TikTok Kate, she on Friday said, I'm having so much more fun now. And she meant because the news is interesting and exciting.
Yes.
And for those of us who remember what it was like to cover the first Trump administration, I tell a story about how one Saturday, I think it was in 2018, I took a nap for 20 minutes on a Saturday and 3 stories broke in the middle of that. And It is exciting and invigorating, and we love the news, and it's great. So it's hard to pay attention to everything. Is there anything that you are watching right now that I should have on my radar?
It's funny that you say that about the first Trump years, because got married in 2018 and tried to go on a honeymoon in the beginning of the Trump administration. And I remember being terrified that some news would break that I'd need to be able to go get my phone. But I had promised my wife that, I would be unplugged for a honeymoon. And so I did. I successfully unplugged. What I learned was there was 4,000 news cycles in that 1 week I was unplugged that each kind of absorbed the next one. So when I picked back up, it was a perfect time to just plug back in. I had missed things, but they sort of got eaten by the next one. And so, I think if you miss a news cycle, just get ready to jump on board the next one. It's kind of like on the subway when you're on one of the express trains where they just keep coming. You'll get on the next one. You'll get it, and you'll get to where you're trying to go. But what I'm looking at right now is I am fascinated by the left being lost in the wilderness and how they're sort of trying to recalibrate. And one of the ways that we're sort of seeing the directions they're trying to move is this DNC chairman's race. And I think you've got a lot of different factions there. The Democrats have been holding back a civil war for over a decade now. And we saw this in 2020 when they sort of got everyone to play nice with each other to get behind Biden with the sort of agreement that who would be waiting in the wings, Kamala Harris. Now that Kamala Harris got her chance and really flopped, all those different factions are still kind of fighting each other just a little bit. But I think media also doesn't even really know how to deal with this. Like, for example, the out the door Biden family pardons were really pretty egregious. But I don't even know if media really knew how to deal with that in the context of everything else going on. But, I think that they're trying to kind of get back to their earlier Trump footing where everything is an outrage. And I think, Media Research Center did a really good quick analysis of this, and they found major networks did, I think, 46 minutes covering those January 6th pardons and only 3 minutes on President Biden pardoning his family. Part of that might be that there's no ratings in talking about Joe Biden anymore, but I also think media is trying to figure out how they can scrutinize President Trump in a new, effective way that doesn't lose them viewers. And honestly, I know SNL is not popular among conservatives, but there was a sketch last week about MSNBC kind of making fun of the media trying to sort of swing at every pitch with Trump and just getting so overwhelmed that they couldn't do it, that when they tried to pick up on another thread, they, the woman playing Rachel Maddow started reading a script saying, this is why this Trump thing is so offensive, and stopped in the middle and was like, this is so boring. And they all stopped and said, okay, President Trump just tweeted about how we're going to fight sharks. Oh, thank goodness we can get back to interesting things. And so I think, it was basically a criticism of media needing to not try and ratchet it up to 11 at every single outburst. And I think it's the same for elected Democrats. They can't really figure out what their resistance is going to look like. You saw the Amy Klobuchar talking about the broligarchs. You've got some Democrats trying to say we're the populist party now because Trump is friends with Elon and all these billionaires. It doesn't really work when your party gave George Soros the Presidential Medal of Freedom 2 weeks ago. And so they're trying a lot of things. They're kind of throwing spaghetti at the wall. Nothing's really, really sticking. But I do think it's interesting to see some of the pressure tactics from Democrats. Elizabeth Warren sent letters to a lot of the different donors to the Trump inaugural committee, like Sam Altman, who, came out and said, it's funny, I never got letters like this when I gave to Democrats. So they're clearly trying to put the pressure on, but I just don't know what's going to land for them until they feel like there's really something to rally around. The deportation rally hasn't worked so far because they know the public is very much in favor of these aggressive actions to answer for bad immigration policies. So I also think you and I talked offline about Alex Soros of the Soros Fund complaining that because they didn't really have results in the elections, despite more dark money being spent for Joe Biden than any time in history, they were kind of complaining that they had basically become a jobs program for liberal activists if they weren't having any real outcome. So I think, I'm watching how the left is recalibrating.
Me too.
Because a big part of our job here as conservatives is going to be explaining why the good things that are happening in the system are good and how we're delivering on promises. That's something that, as we talked about at the beginning here, Democrats just never really tried to do. They never really tried to marry their work
and they never admitted that inflation was a problem. But
exactly.
I can't remember who it was, but 6 hours after President Trump took the oath of office, there was a tweet from this Democrat complaining that food prices were so high.
Hakeem Jeffries.
It was Hakeem?
Leader. The leader
Hakeem.
of House Democrats was like spending his first day saying like,
so
hey, you haven't fixed our problems yet.
So embarrassing.
It is embarrassing.
Come on.
But they're not sending their best,
And as a last point, I know you're not looking forward to the Super Bowl.
Yes, I'm not into it.
Are you boycotting or are you going to watch?
I haven't decided. I mean, I love the commercials. I still think there'll be fun things, but Chiefs and Eagles is just so boring. I just feel like been there, done that. Chiefs are going to get help from the refs. The Phillies, the Philly fans are, I don't know, but I will watch for entertainment value. We'll probably have some good barbecue because the tradition.
Well, I'm just waiting to see if Weston, your nearly 3-year-old, throws any spaghetti against the wall. If that sticks, maybe the Democrats could take a lesson.
He does throw all his food everywhere, so they could take a lesson from him. And can I just say, Dana, you guys, your coverage of Inauguration Week was amazing.
Thank
you mentioned TikTok Kate. The video that she did of you guys climbing more and more stairs to get to the set in D.C. to do the 5, like it felt like I was watching Legends of the Hidden Temple, like navigating twists and turns. But like the dedication, you guys just did a phenomenal job of giving really good insight to a historic moment. And I thought it was really, really valuable.
Oh, how kind of you.
That.
Thank you.
And it was really fun to watch.
She said, let's do a behind the scenes video. I'm like, is anyone going to care? It has like 2.5 million views.
People love it.
Yeah.
The people love the behind the scenes. It's very fun because they see the final product. They see how great you guys are on TV. But knowing how the, sausage gets made is also just super interesting.
Well,
so great
we are blessed to work here and to do what we do. And you know what? To be able to say whatever is on our minds. Thank you for joining me. Matt Whitlock, everyone.
Thanks, Dana.
Listen ad-free with a Fox News Podcast Plus subscription on Apple Podcasts, and Amazon Prime members can listen to this show ad-free on the Amazon Music app.